if you're eating better, and that's more real food, and more real food costs more than fake food, well then combine that with fasting because you just need less of that real food. I think that's an intelligent view, and maybe we defend it. I would defend it as a kind of nutrient biochemist by saying, by eating real food, you're getting so much more nutrition. It's so much more nutrient dense that you can metabolically afford to fast.
Insulin resistance is literally a topic my brain has been obsessing on for several years, but I feel like the last year it was really brought to light when we started seeing statistics that only 12% of Americans were metabolically fit. So I just want to start by throwing that out at you and saying, why are only 12% of Americans, and I know we have a worldwide audience, but why are only 12% of us metabolically fit?
Yeah. So that eye-opening study was based on looking at how well people did in the metrics of the metabolic syndrome. So they looked at waist circumference, blood pressure, blood glucose, and blood lipids, just to maybe lump those together. And they found that only 12% of US adults were good in all of those aspects. And in contrast, 88% failed one or multiple of them. So it's pretty sobering. And I like that you noted the international aspect to your audience. I have a great appreciation for this problem worldwide, insofar as my actual career as a scientist, in a way, started in Singapore, tucked away in Southeast Asia, where I did what's called a postdoctoral fellowship with Duke Medical School there, with the explicit purpose of understanding the metabolic disorders that are becoming so prevalent in Southeast Asia. I've given talks on this topic throughout that part of the world and the Middle East, which actually has worse statistics than we do. So as much as we think the problem's bad here, it's even worse in some other countries.
But do you think, on the topic of food, that we're in a situation where it's a little bit like if you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and gradually raise the heat, it will die? I feel like that's what's happening to our food. Everything has changed about our food. Chemicals are in our food. Fats are different. But humans haven't figured it out. Do you feel like that's what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have been, like every organism, humans have an ability to adapt to their environment within reason. Like every organism, it's always within reason. Just like the frog can't immediately adapt to the boiling water, it would be lethal, of course. But within reason, in this case, the small degradations or the small degrees of change, we can adapt. I think what we've done within the last couple generations is something that is totally unique in the history of humans and human nutrition, which is now, for the first time, we're getting very high fat and high carbohydrate foods. That doesn't exist in nature, really, with one exception, which is milk, where, like you imagine mother mammal giving a perfect food to baby mammal, and milk happens to be high in all three macronutrients: fat, carbohydrate, protein. That means it's a perfect cocktail for growth. But for those of us that are grown, you don't get fat and protein, fat and carbohydrate at high levels together. And I mentioned protein. What we've done is, of course, strip away the protein, because protein is very satiating. So it doesn't make sense for a food manufacturer to want to keep the protein in there, because that's bad for business, because then someone doesn't want to eat as much. And protein is expensive.
Yeah.
And so if they can peel that protein off and do something else with it, well, then that's just another way to make more money. So protein and carbohydrate and fat in nature would never come at a high level without some protein. But that's what we've put ourselves in, where we're eating foods from bags and boxes with barcodes. And that essentially means we're getting high fat, high carb, low protein foods. And tragically, it's the worst kind of carbs, which is refined sugars and starches, and the worst kinds of fats, which are refined seed oils. This is a total departure from an ancestral way of eating that we've put ourselves in very little time.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing from a lot of the public, this is why I love fasting so much, is because this is our food industry. But if I want to eat better food, I'm going to be willing to pay more. So, which is horrible onto itself. And so the way I've looked at this for a long time is that the only way out is to get people to start skipping meals and to start fasting so that we can learn how to not put as much of this food in. Do you see another way for us to change that exact scenario that you just talked about?
In the context of food, and there are other inputs that affect insulin resistance and metabolic health, but food is the biggest, no question. Of all the levers we're trying to manipulate to get healthier, there are a bunch of them there. Some of them are slippery. The food we eat is absolutely firm. We can change that immediately. We can push it up or push it down based on what we're eating. I am a fan of fasting. I like the nuance or the context that you bring in, which is if you're eating better, and that's more real food, and more real food costs more than fake food, well, then combine that with fasting because you just need less of that real food. I think that's an intelligent view, and maybe we defend it. I would defend it as a kind of nutrient biochemist by saying, by eating real food, you're getting so much more nutrition. It's so much more nutrient dense that you can metabolically afford to fast because you've gotten everything you needed in such a condensed or dense nutrient or food stuff that you physically, metabolically, it's no problem if you now go 12 hours or 16 hours because you are nourished. And that's it's in such stark contrast to where most people find themselves, which is they are overfed yet or undernourished. And I kind of refer to that as like a misnourishment, where they get plenty of energy, plenty of calorie, which a human needs to survive. Of course, we have to have energy. Thankfully, we store a lot of it in our fat cells, but then you also need all of the other stuff that comes with that ought to come with nutrition as we're eating. So that's one benefit of intermittent fasting, no doubt. To me, as a metabolic and a fat cell scientist, I just have to emphasize that one of the best ways to improve insulin sensitivity is to lower your insulin. And there's no question fasting is the most effective, rapid way of lowering insulin. When you simply stop eating or drinking energy and calories, insulin has no choice but to start to come down.
Yeah.
So, as we look at a kind of microscopic level, you see, I don't mean literally, but maybe in a small time frame, when someone goes to bed, they're not eating now for the first time in a long time. Insulin can finally start to come down because it takes several hours after eating for insulin to come down. During that period where insulin is at its low or fasting state, the body's becoming more insulin sensitive, and the body starts going into a more fat burning state because low insulin means higher fat burning. Well, if you can fast through that period or somehow prolong it, either by fasting through breakfast or fasting through dinner by just starting the insulin drop earlier, whatever way you do that on either end of the day, you've simply prolonged the period of low insulin, which means you're enhancing an insulin sensitizing state or allowing insulin to do its job a little better and stay at lower levels. But the tragedy is that someone has eaten a big dinner and an evening snack, and their insulin takes a long time to come down. Well, right around the time it's coming down, they're waking up, and wouldn't you know it, they're ending their fast. They're breaking their fast with a starchy, sugary breakfast. It's bagels or cinnamon rolls or toast or cereal or orange juice. And that spikes insulin 10 times over where it had been. And it takes 3 hours to come down. And right around then, they're having their mid-morning snack and then lunch and then afternoon snack. And every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin. That's a wonderful way to never burn fat for fuel. And it's a terrible way to make sure your body is becoming more and more insulin resistant at every moment of the day.
So would you say that the most important meal to skip then would be breakfast?
That is a great question. In fact, Mindy, I'm not going to let you pin me down to that. But that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yes.
For the reasons I mentioned, which is you've been sleeping and it's already low, so just keep it low. And it's easiest because breakfast is one of the less social meals we have. And that really matters. So for me, well, not even me, there's a study that looked at cutting breakfast or cutting dinner. Cutting dinner yielded more significant metabolic benefits than cutting breakfast did. So that's the objective data. However, it's tricky to fast through dinner because that is the social meal. I'm a husband and I'm a father, and that matters more to me than keeping a six pack in my mid 40s. So even though I know as a metabolic scientist, fasting through dinner is going to actually yield greater metabolic dividends than fasting through breakfast, I just can't fast through dinner. It doesn't work. I'm sitting at
Right.
home with my
Well
wife
said.
and kids, and so it doesn't work. Breakfast, in contrast, no, it doesn't upset a family dynamic at all if I fast through breakfast. Even though I'm with my family virtually every breakfast, daddy is in charge of breakfast. That's kind of the family dynamic. I'm there. I'm making crepes. I'm making egg muffins for the kid, whatever it may be. And my kids eat more carbs than I do. It's no problem to them if I'm not eating breakfast, I'm sipping on a cup of tea or something. It doesn't matter to them. The breakfast morning is so busy. People are coming and going. It doesn't upset a social dynamic in my home. And even more the case with lunch when I'm at work all the time. Best bang for your buck would be fasting through dinner, but that is hard to do. So I'd hate for someone to leave our conversation and say, all right, Ben said fasting through dinner, I'm going to fast through dinner, and only do it once successfully and never do it again.
Well said.
And so
Yeah.
the fasting through breakfast is the easiest way to do it, even if it's not quite as high dividend as fasting through dinner, it's still going to be wonderful. So if that's the one that someone can do, then do it.
And yet, if you're listening to this, maybe you don't have a family, or you're like, I want to do whatever I can to lose weight. What I hear you say is then you're going to want to fast through dinner.
Yep, absolutely.
And why is that? Is it just you're going into bed without food in your stomach, less
Yeah.
cortisol surge?
Yeah, yes, that's a great point. There could absolutely be this more pronounced flux or shift in hormones. Maybe when you're eating a lot right before you're going to bed, now it just takes the body a lot longer to clear it because your
Mm-hmm.
metabolic rate has slowed. Energy demands is just much further down. I actually think it's because of a permissive effect that comes in the evening. I know for me personally, after dinner, evening is the witching hour. That is when I'm at my weakest when it comes to
Mm.
temptations and indulgences. I would look at something in the morning around breakfast and not even have a speck of temptation to eat that. It,
So
it, it is
true.
totally unappealing. But if I put that same thing in the evening, oh my goodness, it'll take a Herculean discipline on my part not to indulge. And so if I have just decided I eat a big, heavy, hearty lunch, and then I'm done until breakfast the next day, well, then you're done. There's just no getting around it. But if I've eaten dinner and I can still eat and I'm kind of roaming the house, then I just start snacking. And that's the challenge for me, where if I because I don't fast through dinner, I really try to have a very big lunch. And so because I've found, not that everyone would feel this way, but if I only eat one meal a day and it's dinner as my only meal, then
Mm-hmm.
I almost always overindulge at dinner, and I almost always end up snacking on stuff after dinner and go to bed full and uncomfortable and sleep poorly, and it sets me off for another round of trying to do that again. So I, more and more, as I'm learning more about my own habits, and again, this might be helpful to some, I try to have a big lunch. And so when I come home for dinner, I'm already a little full. And then it just makes eating a small amount of dinner so much easier. And it makes stopping after dinner so much easier than otherwise. But if I have that kind of hunger pressure growing throughout the day and it kind of crests at dinner time, then usually I don't do it well. And so as much as I'm a fan of condensing an eating window and one meal a day in theory, for me, it doesn't work out that well, because if I'm only going to eat one meal a day, it's most certainly going to be dinner with my family. And then it just sets me up to fail. So I'd rather fast through breakfast, have a really big lunch, and then a very modest dinner.
Yeah.
So it's almost like I'm kind of coming down from my lunch, and it just keeps coming down through dinner because it's so modest. And then I just flatline early in the evening with my
And
insulin.
I love that. And actually, I've done that I like to vary my eating styles all the time and my fasting lengths. And so what you're saying, I actually did today. And I like that because when you get home, you're not like, okay, I'm going to break my fast. Get me the food. What do you mean
Hmm.
dinner's not on the table? Like there is an emotional and response to your meal at night that you don't typically have in the middle of the day.
Yep.
But I have to be very strategic at the meal I put together for lunch so that I don't crash. My energy doesn't crash. Do you find that? And if so, what meal do
Oh,
you put together so
for
you're
sure.
energized?
Yeah, for sure. I noticed that mid-afternoon is the hardest for me, where I start to get the most tired and my productivity would tend to go down. I just simply nip that in the butt by not eating carbs for lunch. I'm very, very strict at lunch. And that was a study published by David Ludwig's group at Harvard
Mm,
last year, where he looked at energy availability after, so basically how much nutrient is in the blood after a high carb meal versus a low carb meal. And it was significantly lower in the wake of the high carb meal. And that might be why people get hungrier sooner after a high carb meal, because you've cleared the blood of all the nutrients. Insulin spikes up and it lowers glucose, lowers fats, lowers ketones. Now the brain is thinking, wait a minute, we're getting low on energy. We need to eat. At the
mm,
same time, the brain might be giving us a sense of fatigue because it's sensing the lower energy and thinking, oh, wait, energy's a little low. We need to kind of tamp down our brain metabolic rate, which would be manifest as a fatigue or a tiredness. So I eat a big lunch and I just make sure that it's a lot of protein and a lot of fat and very little or
mm.
very smart about my starches. And that kind of reflects my three nutritional principles in general.
What would be, give me an example. Would you do like a big chef salad?
Yeah. So yeah, some examples. I'm not a big salad guy, but I'd be totally in favor of it. It's just that I don't really have the patience to make it on my own and bring it. That's not
Yep.
in my wheelhouse, and there's no convenient place nearby. So lunches for me is a mix of leftovers from the night before. Like today, it was a bunch of taco meat, just
Mm,
hamburger from the night
hmm.
before that I just mixed with avocado and sour cream, and then I just kind of ate it by the spoonful, so a
Yeah.
pretty ugly, miserable little dinner, a lunch, but delicious and very nourishing. Other times I go to this little hot dog joint near campus and I get two big hot dogs on a plate with a bunch of mustard and sauerkraut, and I eat that, no bun. And then other times when I really need it to be convenient, then I will take a shake. And not to sound like a shill, but a couple of my brothers made a low carb meal replacement shake just for this purpose, which is when
Yeah.
you're low carb, it's sometimes hard to have super convenient foods. And if anyone wants to learn more about it, I won't say any more than that, but go to a website called Get Health. And health is spelled HLTH, no vowels in health, but gethealth.com. And you can learn more about the shake and see my blog posts and
Yeah,
all that.
we'll put it in the notes because I actually think shakes can be really horrible or they can be really beneficial. So
Yep.
whenever somebody creates a good shake, that is an awesome
Yeah, and
tool.
we're just sort of a shake obsessed culture for
Yeah,
various reasons. One, they can taste very good, and two, they're just so convenient.
very
And
convenient.
so depending on what my day is, now I don't think anything's a replacement for real good hearty food.
Yep.
That always ought to be the priority, but the fact is sometimes it just doesn't work. And the more you go low carb, the more you don't have convenient foods. And you
Yeah.
can't just rip open the backs of the box or the bag of junk that you were about to eat for lunch. Real food doesn't come often that way. So for those that find it to be they're time pressed and they can't have planned their meal out or don't have time to hit the hot dog shop or the hot dog joint, well, then I think a shake is always a pretty
Yeah.
good option.
Well said. What do you think's worse? Do you think sugar's worse, or do you think the bad fats are worse?
Oh my goodness. This, of course, you being who you are, the debate that's raging on
Yes.
this topic, most especially on social media. Um, you know, so here, I don't want to answer that definitively, but maybe let me just talk through it for just a minute and put some context here, and maybe that'll lead me to a conclusion. So I do tend to fall on the insulin side of things. I think chronically elevated insulin is so clearly pathogenic, creating insulin resistance and all the problems that come from it, that it's very hard for me to say that refined starches and sugars aren't important. In fact, I have to just tip that way simply because my scientific expertise is so strong that I know the data so well that I just have to say that. However, I acknowledge that there is robust data suggesting that high levels of linoleic acid consumption are also very pathogenic. I just don't do those kinds of studies myself, and I'm not as familiar with the research. So I have to fall on the refined carb side. But in
Okay.
the end, I think we're splitting hairs because the fact is we're getting both.
Yeah.
I think if you remove one and the other, or if you remove one, you've essentially removed the other.
Yep.
Because when people are getting high refined starches, they're getting them from processed foods that are high refined oils. When someone's getting high refined oils, it's not that they're drinking a bottle of soybean oil. They're getting the foods that the soybean oil has been cooked in, which is always going to be a refined starch or sugar.
Yeah.
So in reality, we get them together and there's really no
Mm.
pulling them apart. But if I had to pick one, just because I'm so much more familiar with the science, that I would have to just say, well, the refined starches are going to be a huge problem.
Yeah. No, well said. You're the insulin resistance
Yeah,
specialist here. So
that's right.
I
I'm the
love,
carb insulin guy.
yeah, I love it. And you know what I always tell people is if I came into your house and I swapped out all your oils, I just poured the good oils in the bad oil bottles, you probably wouldn't even notice a difference in taste. So I do feel like some people are very insulin resistant. If they can't get that sugar craving under control, if we just start by swapping out their fats, we at least have a door in.
Yeah, in fact, but even then, Mindy, I think it's genius. The moment we say that, though, we're also immediately forcing them to toss out all the refined foods they're eating, which is such a
Right.
culprit. Because if we're just talking about replacing their cooking oils, which would be huge, it would be huge. Because it's not like these people are getting their carbs because they're making cake at home. You know,
Right.
they're
Good
eating, they're
point.
getting their treats from these stores. And so there's, in reality, there's just no pulling the two apart. But I like your sentiment. If we could just say, you know what, just use that olive oil or use that coconut oil instead. Yeah, but they're not cooking at home. You know, they're eating,
Yeah.
most of that stuff is coming from outside the home anyway.
One thing I've realized in just interacting with so many people is that we only look at insulin resistance if we have an obesity issue or we're struggling to lose weight or we've been given a diabetes diagnosis. But there are a lot of other signs that we are insulin resistant. To help our listeners understand, like, what are some of the other signs? Like, one time somebody brought to my attention and I was like, oh, I'd never even thought about this. If you can't go without food, you're metabolically unflexible, that
Yep.
those mitochondria are struggling. And that could be a precursor to you being insulin resistant. That might be the first sign. How do you feel on that?
Okay, you know how when you're trying to get in and out of fat burner, sugar burner, and sometimes you struggle? It might be that you have a metabolic blocker that's at play here. Want to know what those blockers are? Click on the link above and I'll take you straight to a giveaway and you can have my list of metabolic blockers.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you're bringing this up. And by way of context, you know, if we're saying 88% of all adults in the U.S. have some form of insulin resistance, well, then there is a gap there because only about 60% are overweight or obese. So we have a portion of the population that don't fall into the overweight or obese category by current standards. But yet still would be failing some aspects of metabolic health. So how do we explain those two? Or what might be the less obvious signs of insulin resistance, to your point, rather than just, I have too much fat that I'm jiggling or pinching? That's a great one. If someone can't fast for 12 hours, that's a terrible sign. And in a way probably reflects insulin resistance and chronically elevated insulin, which always comes with insulin resistance. And if insulin is high, good luck burning fat for fuel. And that creates a problem with the person who's fasting, because if your insulin is high because you're insulin resistant, even when you're fasting, it's still going to be higher than ideal. And when insulin is high, you are in glucose or sugar burning mode, and the body runs out of sugar very quickly. And so if you can't go 12 hours with, and you're an adult as a fast, that's a problem.
Yep.
You need to wean yourself off of that starch and sugar and help your body learn to burn fat better. And then it's nourished and it senses it has energy because you're using your own fat for energy, which after all is why it's there. That can only happen when insulin is down. But beyond the context of fasting for or not being able to fast as a sign of insulin resistance, others would be high blood pressure. It is almost a guarantee if someone has high blood pressure that it is caused by insulin resistance. That is the overwhelmingly most common. And then other less very noticeable to the individual and more subtle would be infertility. Erectile dysfunction in men. There was a manuscript published a couple years ago that the title of it is unforgettable. And it's something like, I just said it was unforgettable, but I'll get it wrong a little bit.
Now
I
you
clearly
forgot it.
forgot. I clearly forgot the precise words here, but it was something like, in its being memorable, it was something like, is erectile dysfunction the earliest manifestation of insulin resistance?
Mm,
And in a man, that is a reflection of the problem that's happening at blood vessels in insulin resistance, which is that there's insufficient vasodilation. And good luck getting an
interesting.
erection if you can't have blood vessels that dilate. That has to
Yep.
happen. In women, the most common infertility is PCOS, polycystic
Yes.
ovary syndrome, and that is at its core a metabolic problem, insulin resistance. Now, this really plays in well to to this immediate topic, which is you can have women with PCOS who don't meet the metrics of insulin resistance. They are lean and they look healthy.
Yep.
Even in those women, they have much higher level of insulin resistance at their fat cells than women who have the same body weight but who don't have PCOS. So even there, when they look like they're metabolically healthy, when you actually scratch beneath the surface, you find that they do in fact have insulin resistance. It's just subtle. It's not
Yep.
clinically evident, but with a little further scientific scrutiny, you detect it at the level of where insulin resistance actually starts, which I believe is at the fat cell. These seemingly lean, healthy women with PCOS have insulin resistance at its origin, which is at the fat cell. And that's very likely what's contributing to the polycystic ovary syndrome.
Yeah. And we've, there's another breakdown in how we measure health is we think a number on the scale or BMI gets tossed around a lot as that's the measurement for health. I can't tell you how many women in our community have struggled to get pregnant. They told their BMI was high. We show them how to fast according to their hormonal cycle. And within a month, they're pregnant without even dropping any weight.
That's awesome. Yep, that's right. Yep, that's right. And that is a reflection, just like you said, where insulin resistance is not something that's so manifest on the scale. It often is, but that doesn't mean it always is. Even more the case with different ethnicities. That I like to joke that if you want to be really fat, you want to be Caucasian, because Caucasians appear to be able to be the fattest and yet retain some form of health. But when I was doing my postdoctoral work in Singapore, talk about a difference of body fat and body type. If you compare, if I had two men, one of Chinese ethnicity in Singapore, one of, say, European or Northern European or Caucasian ethnicity in Singapore, same environment, same diet, same culture in a way, even this eating the same food has a different response. But the Chinese guy, he's starting to experience substantial metabolic problems at a very mild body fat level. So he just looks a little overweight, and he's already suffering the metabolic health that would take the white guy, the Caucasian guy, obese levels to get to. So there's massive ethnic differences on how the body stores fat and how pathological or pathogenic it is in kind of starting or contributing to this progression of insulin resistance to diabetes, hypertension, Alzheimer's, infertility, and so on.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd never heard that before. That's fascinating. How much does the microbiome play in it? If I've been on a round of 20 antibiotics and now all of a sudden I can't lose weight, did I just kill all those bacteria to help me manage my blood sugar?
Yeah, so that's what a great question. And it's certainly, I know, a topic of interest. And you framed that in a nice way for me to answer, because I can start with the easiest part of it and then confess the challenge. So at the easy end, we know in humans that after doses of high strength antibiotics, they gain weight. Yeah. It is exceptionally consistent finding across multiple different types of antibiotics. So there's no doubt the microbiome matters when it comes to our metabolic health. But that is, for me, where the certainty ends, because now when the conversation turns into trying to manipulate certain types of bacteria, trying to promote the growth of some and the death of others, and certain foods or habits to change the microbiome, everything we do will change the microbiome. It changes so much. And so for me, I don't like that. That's too shaky ground for me as a
Mm,
scientist. So while there are some scientists undoubtedly who can navigate those shaky waters very well, I like to stay in the still waters of known metabolism and nutrient biochemistry. So I just can't speak to that very well. But in general, I'm a little cautious
mhm.
when it comes to the microbiome and how well we understand it, and how we ought to change it. One, it matters. I say that with absolute certainty based on the human evidence that we do have. But then two, um, how we can change it in a way to work for us, that I just don't know as well, and don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how much is known.
The information on fasting right now that's coming out, I've been looking at the trends on science behind fasting, and I find it really interesting that the current research that's coming out is showing that the most dramatic change is happening at the microbiome level. And when you fast, you're making that specific change. Like there was a study that came out April 2021 where they took two groups of people and they put them on the DASH diet, but they decided with one group they would fast them for 5 days, put them on like a soup liquid diet before they went on the DASH diet. And what they found is when they went into the diet, they got a better result.
Hmm.
And they speculated the change was because of a change in the microbiome.
Yep.
So I agree with you that there's the sensitivity of the microbiome is high, and it can be influenced one positive or negative. But I also think it has so much to do with how we're regulating blood sugar, and we just love to kill every bacteria we can find in our culture.
Yeah. So I think that's all. I'm thrilled to hear that. I do think bacteria matter. I love that bacteria are able to take, these beneficial bacteria are able to take fiber, like soluble fiber,
Mm.
not insoluble fiber. They're able to take soluble fiber and metabolize it into short chain fatty acids that then feed other bacteria and feed the human body. We get to pull those short chain fats in, and talk about metabolic magic. Those little short chain fats, boy, they're minute, they're diminutive, but they punch up above their weight class, where they are known to induce mitochondrial biogenesis. They are known to enhance insulin sensitivity and improve glucose tolerance, so to more rapidly lower glucose after the consumption of a starchy, sugary meal. So in that sense, I'm a great defender of the microbiome, because they do what we can't. But again, it is an encouragement to focus on soluble fiber, the fiber
Mm.
that comes from fruits and vegetables, and not as much regard for insoluble fiber, which is neither a fuel for us nor the bacteria. They just comes through us as bulk, and that's what we'd be more getting from grains. So yeah, I do think there's some metabolic leverage we can have when it comes to soluble fiber, in addition to not giving us a sense of satiety and not providing direct calorie. We're not digesting it, but the good bacteria are digesting it.
So then are we missing out on that necessary fiber for those bacteria if we hop on something like the carnivore diet?
Oh my goodness.
I'm just going to go after all
Yeah.
this controversial.
Yeah, you're trying to get me in
topics.
trouble with like every camp. I'm going to offend everyone today. Yeah, so
Sorry, Ben.
this is where the fact is, there's no question that going on a carnivore diet would change the microbiome. But there's also no question that the metabolic dividends are massive on a carnivore diet. I mean, I have personally seen, I have to say this is an anecdote because there just isn't a lot of evidence out yet. I'm optimistic more will start to come as this is gaining steam. But the metabolic improvements in people that go on a carnivore diet are absolutely mind-blowing.
Yes,
It is shocking how
Yep.
quickly these people start cutting medications and feel better and look better and move better. I've never seen anything comparable, to be frank. So the despite the view I just mentioned, which is the role of soluble fiber in promoting or feeding healthy bacteria as a prebiotic, I have to then say, but it's clearly not essential, because when someone's adopting a carnivore diet, they aren't putting that fiber in their system. There's no question they still have a healthy gut microbiome. I don't think there should be any question. Stool studies, a limited amount of evidence suggests that the microbiome are very much there, but they change profile, which makes sense.
Mm.
I would then just say the microbiome is still there. The gut bacteria are still there. They have changed in their population of who's dominant and who's not. clearly the bacteria that don't need fiber to live are thriving, and that doesn't mean they're bad, because these are people who have just profound improvements in their health. So all of this is in fact part of what um, brings me to my conclusion that we just should be very careful in making conclusions about
Mm,
bacteria and how much we understand, and how much we understand of the individual roles of these bacteria, that despite me already saying repeatedly good and bad bacteria, we don't really know how that balance really works. We know that bacteria are good based on the antibiotic data we have from humans, but whether it's harmful if we're not getting fiber, now these bacteria are starving, well, clearly there's still a bunch of other bacteria that are working wonderfully, because these people are ridiculously healthy.
yeah. Yeah. Is it possible that as humans, we're not meant to all go on the same diet?
I think that's that's almost a cop out for me to agree with, because then, then it just says, yeah, everyone's different, so it might not work for you. But I think it is. I think there's safety in that view. While I do think, I'm bold in saying that I think everyone would benefit on a diet that is lower in refined starches. Um, and whether it's really low carb or still, like, even someone could say, I'm going to go on a vegetarian. I cannot in any way really condone vegan diet. I just think that's too antithetical to human survival. But if someone were vegetarian, primarily, whole food, plant-based, but they're getting the essential nutrients they need from animal-based foods, then there's no doubt they're going to be so healthy. They're going to be super healthy and thrive. There may be other people who have an inherent iron deficiency where that wouldn't work for them. They just need more heme iron from beef, and
Yeah.
so the very low levels. Like, so, this is that one is a low-hanging fruit for me, because I'm a university professor, and every semester I have young women, only young women, who come to me and complain about being tired and they don't have their iron dose correct,
Mm,
and they're always vegan.
yes.
And
Yes.
so I look at that and think the vegan diet isn't working for you.
Yep.
I don't mean to offend people. I really don't. Where someone listening is a staunch vegan and they're going to contact me and say, screw you. I've never felt better. That's great. Good for you. I'm glad. But when you need to be supplementing, um, it does suggest that what you're eating isn't adequate.
Yep.
And so, for these young women they're experiencing, of course, very frequent menstrual cycles, and they're college age kids, so they're very physically active for the most part. That, to me, doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I just want to just put my hands on their shoulders and just say, eat some beef.
Yep.
Don't worry. So yeah, I do think different diets absolutely can work for different people, and it can in fact cover a massive spectrum. Kind of whole food, plant-based, vegetarian diet, I think, can work wonderfully for some people, and then a pure carnivore diet can also work wonderfully. What I would say they all have in common is that they have cut back on their refined starches and sugars and their refined oils. That's what would be common across this whole spectrum, and why
Mm.
I think it could work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that this is my point in asking you if you think that there's one diet for every human. We tend to look at our friends and go, oh, they went on the carnivore diet. They lost a bunch of weight. I'm going to go on it. That's going to be right for me. And what I'm trying to educate my audience on is that there is a unique path that's right for you. And it may look different. It may look than anybody else. And I would agree with you, but every amazing diet should not have refined flours in it and sugars, and it should not have bad oils.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So I would say I presented the case as a kind of nutrient biochemist, sort of physiologist, which is, in the case of the undergraduate who's not getting enough iron, eat more iron. And that's a part of the adaptability of a diet, that we're not, neither you nor I are advocating one single diet. It really is take these principles and then find a way to make it work. But what goes into that also is the cultural differences, that if we were to tell someone who comes from India, you got to go on a carnivore diet, good luck. That won't work.
Interesting. Yes.
That is a culture that
Yeah.
that generally is a heavily vegetarian, heavily plant-based, and culturally it just might not work. And so there are those intangibles of the culture, macroscopic or microscopic, in a country, in a whole ethnicity, or just within a family. that it might not work for someone to go too far to the extremes. So biochemically, we can defend someone adapting the diet, but even culturally, we need to be sympathetic and mindful of the fact that some dietary changes just won't work with some micro or macroscopic cultures.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And again, this is why I want to elevate people's thought and stop trying to fit everybody into the same box. Talk to me a little bit about toxins. So the term obesogens has really been thrown around. And one thing I'd love to know from you, is it true if I put a toxic lotion on my skin, is that making me insulin resistant?
Yeah. So, so there are chemicals, obesogens, as you call them, and I agree that's a great name, that are uniquely fattening, all things equal. Now, the evidence starts to fall apart in humans because there's no causal or mechanistic evidence proving that this happens in humans. So we have correlations in humans that fit well with the causal evidence that we have from animals, from lab animals, where we know chemicals that come from plastics and detergents and even certain lotions, perhaps, they are capable of making lab animals fatter than what the calorie load suggests they should be. So there's something uniquely fattening about some of these chemicals. And again, pesticides and detergents and plastics are really the big culprits. And then maybe to a lesser degree, certain lotions. But that'd be a far, far lesser degree. In humans, we do find that people who have more fat do have higher circulating levels of these chemicals in their blood. So we find the correlation, that's just correlation. We don't know the causality in humans, but we do know the causality in rodents, which kind of gives us some confidence that what we see as correlation probably reflects actual causality. So these are molecules that can be unique fertilizers to the fat cell and promote the growth of fat cells, all calories equal. And these are things like diethylstilbestrol. These are things like bisphenol A, even BPA. Is a known obesogen in lab animals and correlates very tightly with human obesity. So these are chemicals that are all around, and many, many dozens more that I can't even think of at the moment. They are all around us. But it is a strong encouragement, especially for kids who are really setting the tone for how many fat cells they're going to have for the rest of their lives, because we basically set our number of fat cells when we finish puberty, which is late teens in girls and early 20s in boys. People think puberty ends much earlier than it actually does. But nevertheless, that's typically where we've set the number of fat cells we're going to have for the rest of our adult life until our 70s and 80s, when we actually start to lose some, which sounds better than it is. But these obesogens can, in the youth, the fear for me as a father is that I want to make sure I give my kid the best possible start, that when they leave our home as adults, even metabolically, I'm putting them on the right path. And so I do deliberately, I'm very mindful of them drinking too much water from malleable plastic bottles,
Right.
because those squishable plastic bottles that we're all buying our water from the grocery store are going to be very high in BPA. All the more if they've been heated up in any way. If they're warm and sitting in your car, then you're leaching even more of those chemicals into the water. So we ought to be really, as much as we can, where our kids are taking water bottles with them, and everybody does these days, let it be metal or glass, certainly as the best options. And then if it's got to be plastic, just try to get the better plastics. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can just check the BPA levels in all plastic bottles. Look on the bottom and it'll tell you the number, and you can look that number up online. But I think like plastics 3 and 6, I think, were the best, but I can't remember. But if it's BPA free, at least you're removing the elephant in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. We always say get glass, because I guess they're, the way they're looking at the other BPAs now is that they're toxic as well. On the topic of, you have all the fat cells, you're going to get all of the fat cells for your life in your teenage years. Does that mean if I was a overweight 17-year-old and I've been overweight ever since, and now I'm 35 and I want to lose weight, what's happening when I'm trying to reduce my weight down? Are those fat cells disappearing, or are they just shrinking?
They're just shrinking. So so what happens is, so we set the number of fat cells we have prior to the end of puberty, so transitioning into adulthood. And if someone is overweight and then they start to lose weight in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they're shrinking those fat cells. They're not killing them. That doesn't happen. We don't start destroying the fat cells. Fat cells have a natural life. I've heard some chuckleheads, even professors, say, who should know better, fat cells are immortal. That's just ridiculous. They're not immortal. A fat cell has a life of about 10 years. But throughout adulthood, when one fat cell dies, as it has lived its 10 years, it typically will just move into a new fat cell that's been created. So we have this capacity to replace one for one. That actually, we start to lose that in our older age, 70s and 80s. And that sounds like it's a good thing, but let me make sure I answered your question. So you just shrink the fat cells, you don't cut the number back. Now, in older age, what's so interesting about the loss of those fat cells then is that if someone's continuing to eat the same way they were before they start losing their fat cells, all that means is the remaining fat cells start to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because what was once a fat amount that was being held in 5 fat cells has now been whittled down to, say, 2 fat cells, but there's still all the calories and all the insulin telling the body to store fat. It just puts an increasing pressure on the remaining fat cells to store more. And that's the worst way to store fat. When you have individual fat cells getting very, very fat, or what's called hypertrophic, those are the fat cells that become very insulin resistant. And that's probably part of the reason why, as we age, we start to have much more insulin resistance. It's just because even if the person doesn't look like they're storing any more fat than they were before, those remaining fat cells are all more hypertrophic, and that is more pathogenic when it comes to insulin resistance.
How do you get around that?
Yeah, so it is a stronger push as we age to just make sure we're keeping our insulin in check. Because if insulin is low, you cannot have fat cells grow. And in contrast, you have no choice but for the fat cells to start shrinking. So all the more, anyone listening, getting into their 70s and 80s, control your insulin. Those simple rules. Well, I have 4 simple rules: control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, and fast. If you're doing those 4 things, you're doing everything you can. And I would maybe just say be physically active.
But I was going to say, where's exercise? Yeah, where's exercise?
Yeah, well, it's not as much as people think. In fact, there was a study that took overweight type 2 diabetics and put them into 2 groups. One was a group of vigorous weekly exercise, coached multiple times a week, high intensity exercise. The other group was just a low carb diet, like basically following the strategies I just mentioned. And they had significantly greater fat loss, significantly greater glucose and insulin control, just by going on the low carb diet, no exercise intervention at all. Now, again, I'm a huge defender of exercise. Let me be clear.
Yeah.
But when it comes to just maximizing your metabolic benefit, changing your diet will yield significantly greater returns on your investment than trying to exercise. You can't out-exercise a bad diet.
Yeah.
It's cliche, I know, but it's true.
Well, when I went into my 40s, I started to do more fasting. And as I started to drop weight and enjoy my body more, I stopped exercising as much. And then I started to think to myself, why am I exercising? And then I realized, I'm exercising for brain health. That's what I'm exercising for. And it was a beautiful switch, because then I totally looked at my exercise different. I wasn't trying to run marathons to keep my weight where I wanted it to be.
Yeah, good for you. I'm very quick to say your reasons are slightly different than mine, but they certainly align. Eat smart to be lean and metabolically healthy, and exercise to be strong. Yeah. I exercise, well, one, my ego, I went bald in my early 20s, and I got to give my wife a reason to come home to me every day or to let me in the house. I still want her to be interested in me physically. So I want to look healthy, but 2, I want to be a healthy grandpa, even though that is 10 years or more down the road. I really want to be the kind of grandpa who can go skiing with his grandkids, where I can get on the ground and wrestle with my grandkids and get right up and throw them up into the air and play with them and play on the playground. A healthy diet will certainly help with that, but to just be physically strong enough to, pick up my grandkids, you have to be challenging your muscle to do that. So my reasons aren't necessarily staying lean and metabolically healthy. It's just, I want to stay physically capable.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that.
Okay, are you fasting and you're still not losing weight? Check out this video because you might be missing a key part of your fasting experience that's gonna unlock weight loss. So if you think about it, all the humans that emerged out of that time have the gene that allows us to go without food. And that gene, they believe, is in all of us today.